All right. Blessings to you and all your relations. Blessings to everyone listening or watching in the future. We're here with Underworld Party interviews, and I believe in this is I did some math before because I have all these pre-recorded things that I titratedly give out, and I think this is technically episode number 13 of the Underworld Party interview series. And so I thought that was an auspicious number for you to inhabit.
I love it. I feel really blessed too, just to be welcome into this space and um, this magical container that you have set up. So thank you, Dare.
Thank you. Would you love to, just introduce yourself to the peoples?
Yes, my name's Stephanie Adam Santos, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. I'm a poet and tarot reader and slug-like creature. If you could see my the internal picture of myself, it would be something like out of a Ghibli, like those giant pod creatures from Nausicaa Valley of the Wind. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm one of those trying to exist through
Like a
various forms. Yeah.
luminous giant snail creature that like lives in a different time zone and yeah,
Very
totally.
mindless on the inside and constantly for some reason torturing myself with trying to express that through language, through thought, through oh yeah.
Totally. Well, you've come to the right place. I welcome all luminous snail-like creatures from magical worlds, and I'm excited to just have a conversation with you because I believe I can't remember exactly where I met you, but it was a few years ago. It was definitely pre-COVID. It was
Somehow we
either
crossed paths. I wonder, I don't, this might not be right, but if it was at, there was a BIPOC marketplace or does that ring any bells? Like an
I mean,
intersect,
it does. I'm
something like that.
something like that. I mean, I don't remember the location as much as I remember that you were very clear about a kind of processual a process of writing poetry that really spoke to my animistic sort of multiple voice, like where the hell does poetry come from kind of thing,
Mm.
like the ability to take inspiration from disparate sources and sort of just they and weave them together, and it's almost like it comes and you're not doing the writing, like you're not necessarily the writer. You're not like, oh, I'm writing a poem about such and such. It's more like, oh, here's some strings and fungi and magical, oh, it just happened to have here. And the thing that really spoke to me was you used bibliomancy, like not just consciously but transparently, and you were just like, oh yeah, you know, you were just like, oh yeah, like and I have the book here that you recommended.
Oh, that's the one
The
dictionary of
one,
symbols. That is
I'll say it for everyone listening, it's the Penguin Dictionary of Symbols, which I think is like $2, like,
incredible. That book, I found it when I was like 15 or something, and it's been my Bible. It's just such a glorious, uh, thick, weight. It's perfect for bibliomancy. It feels great.
yeah. And for those who don't know what bibliomancy is, would you love to sort of conjure a pithy explanation?
Yeah, it's divination with a book, and it's called bibliomancy because originally was done with Bibles. Um, but I think stichomancy, I might be wrong. I think stichomancy is the broader form, it's just like with any book. But I would say it should be a book you consider worthy of divination. Don't try it with chicken soup for the soul.
Yeah.
You bring your question, or maybe it's not a question. Maybe you're at, maybe it's just wanting to commune with another type of intelligence, and you use the book to, let's say you do have a question. Should we do an example live?
Yeah, let's do an example because that's fun.
Yeah. So let's say, Dare is holding the book, and so the power is in their hands. And so let's say my question I'm bringing is, what is something that we should, take into mind and body right now, collectively?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so there will, however, everyone has their own method. Some people flip through and say stop, or, how do you like to do it there?
I do like to flip and either say stop or just stop and maybe point, like use my finger without looking,
That's how
and
I.
then just sort of read. Um, and I like to do it like more than once. But one time, I think, as just an example, is useful. I think it's just, we'll do that and just read a few of the words that come from that.
Yeah. So what is something we should be thinking about or feeling about right now?
Okay.
Stop.
I'm going to do my finger. You want to say stop again?
Yeah. Stop.
The dawning of that center is the awakening of consciousness.
Thank you for that. You see how it works. It is. And what's the larger entry that's under?
The larger entry is really intense. It is about Mayans. It is about Mayans. It is about the succession of four suns in the Aztec tradition, standing for the creation of a world, which with the fourth sun was imminent but not yet manifest. And only the appearance of the fifth sun, the sign of the present age, completed the manifestation. So it's about like a number of suns, cardinal points and crosses. I mean, it's pretty intense.
Wow. Can you read it again?
Yeah.
Just the original part you landed on.
Yeah, the dawning of that center.
The
So
dawn.
the dawning of that center is the awakening of consciousness.
Yeah.
And the context, I'll read before and after. I'll read the sentence before and the sentence after because I think that's interesting to kind of move out from it both forward and backwards in time. So right before it is the fifth sun corresponds to the center or middle of the cross which they form. And the line after is five is therefore the number which symbolizes human world consciousness. And then the Aztecs assigned the central sun to the god, the god who is the lord of fire, sometimes represented by a butterfly. And it's, I think, Xiuhtecutli, Xiuhtecutli,
Mhm.
Xiuhtecutli. And, uh, it ain't an accident. You know what I'm saying?
It ain't an accident. Yeah. I was just thinking about, just going back to the fragment, you know, the idea of a center dawning. You can see the sun, right? Like that already is there. And just that, I'm really interested in that idea, like the literal sun, and its
Yeah.
the actual force that it sends down through light, which is the birth of all. It is at the center of that, the great mystery of whatever life is.
Yes.
But I think there's something really beautiful there in the thinking about like the physical embodiment of something within something so abstract as consciousness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the interesting thing is that, like, when you or I go into the word that comes, it becomes like a doorway into something, right?
Yeah.
It's not it's not only the facade by which it reaches us, which is still beautiful. It's like, oh, this sentence in this book, right, which has a sort of a particularity to it. it's a kind of specificness, right? But then when you actually take that in, like you're drinking water or something, or you're and it evokes or reminds or sort of opens into this whole other associated journey, dream, whatever. Um, and to me, it's like the power of language is not merely in its power to name things and keep them sort of contained within their naming,
Mm.
but to actually like go into that paradoxical world where the containment and the specificity of each word and the phrase actually unlocks something quite unlimited, right? Like the limitation leads to a kind of unlimitedness. And that's the that for me is why poetry. Like why poetry? Like why poetry?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to what you said. There's so many ripples, it's hard to even know which one to go after. But the first metaphor you gave of like drinking water, taking in language as drinking water, resonates so deeply because it speaks to that really livingness of and how we create meaning um, in real life, I would say, versus how a socially concepted a socially accepted way of like how meaning exists maybe in more abstract forms in books and institutions and how we learn things that are parceled versus how it really is, what knowledge really looks and feels like, and how it's a process that's happening that we are living into cellularly. I think that's everything.
Right. Right. It's like the kind of like salt water, the osmotic quality of sea creatures. Like I'm talking about like, jellyfish and anemones and sponges and like, it's kind of like they are just like they're not quite that different than the actual ocean that they swim in.
Yeah.
Like there's a kind of like, well, okay, so that's water, but that's jelly, and it's like not too different, it's like, so the salt osmotic squishiness is really passing through all the time, like much more obviously than our metaphor of, because we're doing that too. Like in the moment, my breath and my
Yeah.
skin are kind of off gassing, you know.
Yeah.
And so there is a way in which I'm like transferring like new minerals and salt and water through my layers, but we have this illusion of hard boundaries, so we get to sort of, so that also transfers to how we think about the world. It's like as it appears then we think about it, but what you're talking about is the kind of the way it really is, which is like reminds me of like how babies learn language. It's extremely soupy.
It's all soupy. And I love what you said about the air because we like to think of it as almost just not there, an absence, but really it is. If it were dyed purple or something, you could,
Yeah,
it
like, oh,
would be constantly moving and everything touches everything, once you realize, how sound, the physical nature of sound, the waves, the air, everything touches, and everything's living and everything's partaking and part of each other. And yeah, that's my stuff. I feel like that's the reality that feels close to my core.
yeah,
I
like
also
the,
want it. Your talk of jellyfish brought up I almost said a dream, but I don't know if it was a dream or a childhood hallucination. It was somewhere between the two.
yeah. I like those.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like when you're a little bit sick and have a fever as a kid, and like things start to feel a little different. But I had this vision, I guess I'll call it, of being on my way to heaven, and or I don't know if it was heaven, but being on my way to face God or the divine or something like that. And air became solid like jelly, and I was moving through air solid, like slowly moving through this like jelly substance towards light,
Mm-hmm.
basically, towards the sun.
Yeah.
And I just remember as a kid being like, that's the true heaven. You know, I had this,
Yeah,
I
of
was
course,
like, I
of
was,
course.
I was like, that's the truth, not this other stuff I've heard.
Right. Heaven is really just like a plasma field, ocean. You know, it's like, whoa. I mean, I truly resonate with that. I'll share with you an article later that I've been sharing around, which is by an Asian person talking about like the fallacy of the Big Bang and a lot of things like what is cosmology, like how do we study and how our cosmology kind of infects our behaviors and our like our cosmology and our worldview affects what we allow to exist in our mind, but is still out there, right? It's like it colors the world in a certain way. And um, I'm just wondering, like, was your family religious when you were a kid and had this epiphanic plasma dream?
My mom, so my mom, who's Guatemalan, was raised very Catholic, but in an interesting way. Um, you know, in a syncretic way that where the Catholicism in Latin America is very tied to indigenous, you know, viewpoints and practices, and so it has a totally different flavor than
Yeah.
like European Catholicism, but it had a lot of that in it. But also my grandmother, my mom's mom, was illiterate, so her understanding, like literally, I would see her holding the Bible upside down, like it was a sacred object to
Right.
her. It was, and I've never met, you know, someone who for whom that type of religion was so animistic. Like the way she viewed Jesus and the way she understood these concepts from this illiterate point of view that didn't really have formal training in it, just really instinctual.
Hmm.
It was really beautiful, but it did have, you know, also a lot of the imported Catholicisms of shame and da da da. But so there was that side of things. And my mom, who's very rebellious, also considers herself Catholic and kind of like you were describing as a scavenger, takes what's useful to her, but throws a lot out. And then my dad is a hardcore atheist. He was a war vet. You know, he's seen the worst of humanity. He's skeptical of anything that is, you know, you can't prove
Hmm.
in that way. And so it was kind of coming from between those two places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like most mixed kids, we're constantly in a strange crossroads in which like lots of different ancestors are trying to tell us the way it is. It's like,
There's
oh,
a lot of ways.
yeah, there's a lot of stories here that kind of contradict sometimes. Oh, that's very interesting.
I was interested earlier before we started recording, you described yourself as a crossroads person or
Mm,
something. I don't know if you use those exact terms, but
yeah.
uh, I I had found out a few years ago my Nawal, which in I think it's I actually don't know if it originate if that system originates with Aztec or Mayan or if it was or whatever precursor,
Yeah.
but basically the pre-Columbian version um, of astrology in that way. And my sign was Ebb, which is a crossroads. It represents one who dwells in the crossroads as well. And your purpose is one of linking. And the image I got when I was thinking about to how you were describing this thing that you and I share in common of being kind of scavenger like, or how we in our processes. I thought of, have you seen Spirited Away?
Yes.
The Kamaji figure with the
Mm,
many arms, who's
mm,
kind of pulling all these spices and he's serving the ghosts in this bathhouse. And he's just kind of unconsciously, I don't know if he's really thinking or his arms are thinking, but they
right.
are
Right.
individually doing, like, I don't know how many arms he has, but a lot, and they're all maybe 8 because he's spider like, but he's doing all of these things processes at once, and it's somehow all working out in this beautiful way that I feel probably you and I both have experienced, where you don't know why, how everything's aligning when it feels like it should be utter chaos, but somehow,
Totally. Yeah, there's a kind of tentacular intelligence happening. It's
yeah.
very octopus-like. Like I like the octopus as a as like a kind of demigod because it shows us a completely alternate way to arrange a nervous system,
Mm,
right? And it's like its skin is like its brain is its central processing unit is kind of distributed
yeah.
amongst its um, nerves and dendrites and proprioceptors and everything so that it doesn't have to like it doesn't have to collaborate in the same way that we do where like we are often doing something in trance and then we have to like come back to some kind of center and like make sure it's okay and then redistribute like we're kind of doing this all the time, right? Like and the octopus is kind of never needs to do that because all of itself is truly integrated. Like it's really integrated. Its whole self is always sensing in 360 degrees. So there is no central, you know what I mean? Like, um, it's a
That's
much different way to
amazing.
think, you know?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful a way of having having a nervous system and kind of being in the world. It makes me think a lot about why why are we so human centric, in terms of like why are, yeah, I guess, when you look at a creature like that, or like a dolphin who has is so advanced in a, scientifically, in a way that we are brain wise, but without arms to make human tools. It's just like, how does all that look emotionally, and the emotional life and evolution of the dolphin?
Totally.
Or, there's all these creatures around us that have such incredible wisdom, through their bodies, through their shapes.
Right.
And yet, because they don't have human shapes, we that wisdom is somehow lesser. It's wild to me.
Right. But it's because, like when we go into the dolphin's aura or psychic aura,
Yeah,
we can sort of start to dream like the way we dreamt when we were in the womb, where like when we were in the womb, we weren't able to like, you know, I don't know, go carve a stick or something, with something that someone with hands and feet can do.
mhm,
Um, so there's this kind of like amniotic dreaming, which is still like deeply complex, but it's not complex in the way that we are now here outside of the womb,
yeah,
talking in three-dimensional space. There's a kind of like imagine all of the pre-emotions that we had that we can't even name. Like we don't even have the linguistic capacity to just get barely close to what that might have been like.
yeah,
And I think about that in like the octopus and the dolphin and like, whatever bacteria lives in space, where there's a different it's just the context is so different, but they're swimming in that context.
yeah,
It's again that like plasma field. And so if you don't have the so-called agential tools that we take for granted as humans, which includes our mouth structure to kind of create such elaborate sounds and words, and then the hands to sort of go out and change the world in a certain way, where does all that energy go? It
yeah.
has to go somewhere.
It has to. Profound. I mean, that's why I think of, yeah, creatures, who have this, profound intelligence. Like, what I just I can almost imagine what that must feel or look like.
Right,
So special when all of it hasn't gone into self-serving tools.
right, totally.
But
Like a
unless,
kind of like a kind of telepathic gardening, where it's like all that psychic energy has to communicate, it has to commune, right? It has to go into a field in which it does something and then feed the feedback loop has to come back to the creature, right?
Yeah, it's got to. And we know like in the case of dolphins, they're so communicative with each other, and they have such profound family systems. I imagine it's somewhere in their sense of, the communal, that their genius kind of in a way that we can't really fathom.
Right? Like their
Our
social nuance must be so complex, like the density of information in a single click or a single chirp, like the density.
and, yeah.
Right.
It's also, when because our senses are quite amazing as well, just what we're able to communicate with non-verbally.
Mhm.
And all this is reminding me of this time when I was visiting friends in northern Vietnam who are Hmong, and you know this particular friend was illiterate and just, you know very living very close to nature. I should say that didn't have access to phone or technology in the way we do. And um, there was a time when I was looking for my purse. I left it somewhere in the house. And the house, it has a dirt floor, it's made of bamboo through like old traditional knowledge. And I literally just, and it was just a random thing. I think I wanted a photo that I had in the purse. And this was, you know, like hours into the night when we were hanging out. My eyes just flicked. I like was looking for it for a split second. And she was like, "Oh, you're looking for your purse." She went and got it for me. Like she just knew. And I had that same kind of experience many times with her and her sisters, where the smallest physical gesture that I gave was immediately understood, comprehended, and reacted to. Like so much. I remember one time we were walking too out in the rice terraces, and they were like, "Oh, there are new tourists in the area," and I was like looking and I couldn't see, and then finally with like binoculars I could see the tiniest speck in the distance of someone moving, and they already knew which family they were going to, who these, there was a whole level of information understood because of their, closeness to their context. It was so alive, their environment that they lived in was so present to them. It really it really struck me. And when I was there for, I think I had been there for 6 weeks at one point, and really steeped in this kind of earth-based living, being away from technology, being away from reading, even being away from everything, just kind of really being with them. And I was on our friend's motorbike, and he was taking me to see something. And he didn't speak English. I didn't know what he was taking me to see. I just loved being on motorcycles. And so I was like, yes, I just want to do this. And it was a really bumpy ride. He's a real wildcat. So he was going up, small waterfalls, like just doing crazy stuff on the motorcycle, which I love. I never want to be off of a motorcycle. And all of a sudden on this journey, I suddenly felt like I want to be off the motorcycle. Like I felt like a pit of dread. I never feel that. And I saw some water, which is, just like water trickling down the trail on the sides. And he pointed out like a small waterfall. And I just felt like a knife stab when I saw the water. And I'm like a water sign. I love water. These were such weird sensations. I want to get off the motorcycle. This water feels wrong, bad. I was like getting like negative feelings. And then he took me to kind of a little like squalid kind of village that had been abandoned. He got really quiet. We looked around a little and then went back. Then later when I was with his sister, she asked me if I saw, and she was like, yeah, so that village, basically was destroyed in a flood, and everybody died. The buffaloes died. They all know that I'm a vegan and very connected to animals, and so they always tell me when there's anything involving animals. And she told me that all the animals had died, the buffaloes had died, people had been displaced. And it just hit me like somehow my body was sensing the death that had happened there the year, it was like a year before, and he had taken me just to kind of see that. I don't know why he took me, to this day. I don't know why, but it really struck me that after being there for so long, I felt so connected to these feelings that it felt like being psychic. And
Right.
it was just my body coming awake in ways that aren't very possible here.
Right. Like somehow the signal that the water was carrying, which it was still carrying some kind of memory information, and there wasn't as many barriers in the way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think in creating poetry or in processes, there's a lot of me trying really hard to step outside of myself in whatever way I can, to
Right.
step outside of myself mentally, or to go so deeply in that there's that whole, um, I like how the way you put it earlier, this like conceived cosmology of things that can be limiting. Like how can I'm trying to kind of go into my slug zone, my mindless
Yeah.
receptor zone,
Yeah.
and then just take whatever's there to be perceived or experienced, and then waking back into some kind of consciousness where I can then collage and put together and find, then that consciousness becomes useful, in like perceiving patterns or whatever it is.
Right. Right. It's more, but it's more like the revisioning or the editing. Like the human consciousness is more like a revisioning, editing, pattern
Yeah.
arranging,
Yeah.
like a pattern arranging. Yeah, I was curious about this because I've read some of your recent work that you're coming out with, and I was really wondering, like at a certain point, I was like, oh, is this just like a trip narration? Like is just like this isn't actually poetry. This is just literally like this happened and then this happened and then this happened, but this is the most accurate way to tell it. It's like
Exactly.
I was wondering about that, like the process of what people might call generation of material or material generation when you're creating content but you don't quite know where it's gonna end up and you're just kind of creating content. um, and I think it's different for a lot of people, but I'm glad we're sort of tentatively entering into this because for many times I don't feel like I'm consciously creating a damn thing,
Hmm.
but I feel like there's a kind of like I'm receiving something or I'm picking up something that's there and I'm just like transcribing it. It's like, oh, okay, there's a rock on the ground and I wrote rock. And I know that that's not exactly what happens because the phraseology is very strange. It's not like I picked up a rock, but it feels like that sometimes. It feels like, oh, yeah, rock, bird, tree, river in between, um, and then I sort of like have to go, oh, right, this is how poetry happens. But I even had to rename my poetic process to like not call it poetry making. You
What
know
do
what
you
I mean?
call it?
I call it Afropoiesis,
Mm.
um, which to me, so it's like, I created this word through its own process. So I tried to name the process that was happening, which was like, it felt self-arising, like it felt like the root of poetry, which was like poesis, like a kind of auto-poetic kind of, oh, something is making itself happen, like a kind of emergence of selfness, but I'm not doing it. I'm just kind of, oh, here it is. But the Afro part is that first part of Aphrodite, which is interesting because it's like foam. It means foam,
Mm.
like foam from the
I
sea.
love that. Yeah.
So Afropoiesis actually means foam becoming.
That feels very, very accurate, to what the process feels like for me, and the way that the sea kind of throws up this foam that collects. That's
Yeah,
exactly
totally.
that's exactly the process. It's like you're really just there to gather what you get, like the refuse of this big living thing, that's far more powerful, mysterious, and unlimited. And I think that what you said in the beginning, that you feel like you're not creating anything, I feel that all the time. In fact, I feel most of the time like nothing's happening. And I think there can be a lot of pain and tension around that as a creator,
Totally. Yeah, totally.
a lot of crisis and kind of questioning of your path. But
Yeah, totally.
even the book that you're talking about, Dream of Shiva, it I just felt, if someone had asked me, how's the writing going, I would have been like, I haven't written in years. That was the feeling. And then one day I collected all these fragments I had, and there was the book. And I was like, when did this happen? You look at some pages and it's like, did I even write this? I should Google it to make sure it's not someone else. 'Cause it's like so
Totally,
alien.
totally.
Yeah. And then it's not until after I'm like, well, do these make sense together? And then then you start reading and being like, oh wow, they do fit together somehow. Uh,
Totally.
and yeah, it's such a mysterious process.
Yeah. I mean, I often think of it like this process you're talking about, which is like the kind of over time uncovering and remembering things that you don't remember doing,
Yeah,
but they're there in your book and you're like, well, this is my handwriting. So clearly, I did it. But it's like a weird archaeology. It's like I buried these things and then brainwashed myself to forget them, but I didn't do any of that on purpose. Like none of this was contrived. Like I'm not saying that this is a process, trademark, XYZ, like this is not like some hypnotic thing I'm doing to myself. This is more just like the secretions of the slug,
yeah,
and then they make marks, and then I'm like, oh, how, why, oh, and then I just find notebooks that are filled up, but I'm like, oh right, this is like from 2.5 years. And you look at it and you're like, what even? But in that new frame of reference, like given enough time and distance, they do somehow just sort of like they either like edit themselves somehow in that moment, right? They're just like, oh yeah, that goes here, and it's almost very like cooking at that point. It's
yeah,
like, oh, I gathered all this food some way, somewhere, I don't know. Oh, but now I just make a stew, and you chop it like this, and you do this thing.
yeah. And then it's like not a part of you anymore. And I think when in those weird moments of creation, it's still attached to you. Like my greatest poetry teacher, Lucy Brock-Broido, she would say, fresh poems were still quote unquote wet from the other side. And I feel like it's so hard to see those things because they're like umbilically linked to you, and you have to have that weird distance then to be able to come back to it and like be like, oh yeah, what is this weird document?
Right,
Yeah,
right. Because the freshness and the connection like colors our perception of it. Like it's almost like we can't see it clearly yet, and yet there's a kind of beauty to that sort of freshness too, where like because it's saying something more than what it's saying.
yes, it's like a dream, and it's a lot like when it makes total sense in the moment, and then you step back and you're like, whoa, what did that just dream, or how did, somehow this was that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always go back, and it's like if you were to ask me what some of the pieces mean, it's like I have no idea anymore. I'd be like reading. I'd have to go and like do an analysis and try to figure it out, because it's like in the moment something larger pushes through, and then yeah, I'm kind of left. It's like sometimes even words that I don't use find their way into it. I'm like, what is that word? There was
Sure.
a word in one of my manuscripts, grist bite. And I was, I remembered writing it, but I couldn't remember what it meant. And I couldn't find it online. Like it didn't have a definition. I was like, did I make that word up? And then I found it in some obscure dictionary that it's like the grinding, it's like an arcane word for like grinding of your teeth.
Oh my
And
God.
then as soon as I remembered that, the poem flooded back, and it was like, oh yeah. And so I like that they can record these things that come through us that then are forgotten or pass, it's like words or sensations or meanings, and then they take on a new life.
Well, that's interesting too, because in that way, the word grist bite was almost like the key and the door, you know?
Yeah.
Like it's like, and then once that key and that door are like opened, it's like the whole thing returns in some kind of way, like, oh yeah, of course, duh.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. That happens in dreams too. If you forget your dream,
Yeah,
sometimes you just need to remember one part, like one
right,
tiny little fragment, and then it comes back and you're right there in it.
right,
Yeah.
totally, right. And this is interesting. Like I'm so in love with the processes by which we've been given a gift of like whatever you want to call it. Like you can call it the gift of consciousness, the gift of association, the gift of symbology, the gift of language. But like for me, it's more about like these portals or doorways that are almost like every cell in the entire universe is like a doorway. Like there's a and when we open a doorway, we're somehow connected to a very specific yet completely un like consciously remembered pathway between doorways. It's like, oh, I opened that doorway and suddenly it connects to, it kind of maps itself, in a way. Um, and I've always been fascinated by like where the ideas come from, like where do the ideas come from? And I I'm so like even for a long time I had a real problem calling myself an artist because in this Western context, an artist is very like is supposed to sort of like know what they're doing, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I
And
feel
like is supposed to be able to explain how you get from point A to point D or whatever, like like it's some kind of math or something. But I've come to, fall back in love with the way that it seems to actually be, which is like it seems random, but there's an intelligence behind it, and that intelligence is not mine. Like there's a um and earlier you were talking about like the hidden processes, like how hidden everything is
yeah.
and messy and like not what is that phrase they use for in television, like not fit for prime time, like it's not sanitized yet, it's not like polished.
Yeah, it, yeah, I feel exactly as you do on those things, and that there's so much mystery to the process, and even the word process, I don't know where it begins and ends. Like and being an artist, I think there's times when there are times when I'm sitting down to work, right? And I make something happen, and if it happens neatly, I'll claim it as my process. Gladly, like great, I'm doing it. But
Yeah,
that's like 1% of the time. Most of the time it's not that. It is so messy, and it's happening so invisibly, and it's mixed into every other aspect of life.
right,
And um,
right. It's not like somehow the art happens when you sit down at the blank page or something, right?
yeah, well, yeah. And then it's that weird balance, because sometimes I give way. I'm like, okay, no blank page, and then I give way to all of life, and then I'm scrambling back for that blank page. Like I need that. I need
Yeah.
that. I need the illusion of that cleanliness. I need that moment of
Totally.
pretending, it's like I'm in and out of illusions about
Right.
who I am, where I am, what I'm doing, and somehow in the mix of all of that, things happen.
Totally. Yeah, somehow in the mix of all that, we produce art or whatever the hell that is. But um, strange fruits or something. It's like I don't know how long in the pipeline some of these so-called artistic nuggets have been sort of working their way through soil systems. Like sometimes I don't know if I'm just the current end of like some ancestors need to write. You know what I mean? Like some, like somebody way back like didn't get to write poetry or something, and like it's been fermenting in the system for like, however long it's been fermenting, and then it's like, oh blah, blah. I'm just the person who had the computer, like or something, and I'm just like, okay, well, whatever. But
I'm very into those mysterious, like what you were, the bigger question, where do ideas come from, like that.
mhm.
Um, I think we do channel so much in all kinds of ways, and that, so I rarely have an idea, to be honest. I just like
Yeah, totally. Right.
I'm such a mindless, you know, opening and whatever. I'm like sitting at the crossroads with white eyes blank. That's how
Hmm.
sometimes
Totally.
kind of dreaming and receiving things. And every now and then I'll recognize what I'm receiving, but I'll recognize where the idea came from. Oh, it filtered through this and this. And it usually is a kind of scavenger type thing, like in dreams, like where this happened today, and then I'm also reading this, and I'm
Right.
interested in this other thing, and somehow they've all merged into a chimera in the dream, and
Yes.
it usually happens on the page too.
Totally. I have that same experience. And another interview I've done with a songwriter, she talks about her dad being like a collage, like his process being like collaging, like the art of like taking garbage and putting it together, and that's art or something, like
Yeah.
recycled art and collaging. And I find that like that chimeric quality too is like, in fact, sometimes the only way to sort of like purge, like in some way, like excrete something from my system, is to sort of like recognize that the gibberish I'm writing is actually this like chimeric entity that like needs to be sort of like squeezed out so that I'm not like carrying it anymore. And then it's not even like I care about like, is this going to be published, because that's not the point. It's almost like there's like a ritual action of like, okay, it's on the page, at least like that
Like an
kind of happened.
exorcism.
Ugh.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, no, these things take hold of us and kind of torment us from inside sometimes. And
right.
I feel that actually in this book, Dream of Shibalba, there was a lot of fire imagery coming through at one point, and I assumed it was because of all the fires here, everywhere, but
Yeah.
specifically in Oregon at the time.
Yeah.
And I just, that was the easiest reason why it was there. And true, that was probably a big reason why the fire imagery was coming through. But then this whole major thing that I had forgotten about, I was reminded when I quote unquote accidentally wrote about a woman burning. And then I remembered that my great grandmother burned alive, um, you know, like caught on fire when she was warming tortillas by the fire, and her skirts caught fire. And she ended up only having liquor nearby, and she poured that on herself to put out the fire, and engulfed her entire body. And suddenly I realized she was in the book. And then when I went back through, I saw her everywhere, and it was her pain and her body that was, speaking.
Totally.
And it's not like a clean narrative that then became like cleaned up in the book. Like I let
No.
it stay, excuse me, I let it stay messy and tangled like that.
Right.
And but that happens all the time, where it's like, I think I think there's some logical reason why some specific image or whatever came through. And then it's not until like way later,
So
like a year later, where I'm like actually reading the poems, not just kind of half asleep
right.
browsing through what I've
Yeah,
done.
yeah. Right. Right, right,
Yeah, yeah.
right. Yeah, and what you say about like leaving it messy, I think is really important to honor the the actuality of our lives and our families and our ancestors. Like there's this kind of need or this kind of weird, I don't know if it's an addiction or something, but everyone talks about it, right? Like resolving everything, like this fucking word, resolution, resolving. And it's like I've often, for a while in my practice really said no to that. Like to actually actively resist this kind of this addiction to resolution. This addiction to kind of like, oh, now it's all better or whatever the fuck, whatever the fuck we're talking about, like somehow we can heal the or whatever.
Yeah.
And instead just going like, well, you know, why can't the resolution just be the exact tangle that it actually is? Like why is that unresolved? Like why is the tangle somehow worse than, like there's this,
Yeah.
I think that goes back to the language we're using and the worldview we're using, where we write from left to right and it's not pictograms.
Mhm.
And so when we understand that the marks we're making used to be just like pictures and hieroglyphs and that's a different way of writing too, and a different way of thinking, where images placed next to each other tell you something more than if you just wrote linearly,
Yeah.
like a paragraph. And I'm looking behind you and I see both of those ways. Both of those ways are there, like images juxtaposed sort of non-sequentially and get to like ping pong off of each other in non-linear ways. And then this other page of like linear writing that has a kind of flow that is trying to be ordered in a
Yeah.
specific sequential way. And I just sort of see, it's like, it's like the minds of our indigenous ancestors and the minds of our westernized ancestors, right? It's like
And this, I'll tell you, this side over here with all the note cards, this is my torture chamber. And this side over here with the tarot and the imagery, this is where I get to be totally mindless. And that's where pleasure and meditation, for me, that it's like this torturous thing of writing has to come through for whatever reason. I can't let it go. But
Mhm.
the two, if I didn't have some other way to, if I didn't have these other modes that are not so linear and about language in this really, you know, yeah, linear way, I don't think I could make it. But
Right.
there was something, a couple things. So when you were talking about the hieroglyphs, it reminded me of this thing I recently read. Um, I wish I could remember where, but it was kind of talking about Mayan hieroglyphics and how sometimes they'll just the hieroglyphic itself will sprout legs or arms or head and becomes more than just a hieroglyph. It's actually an image representative of the thing it's representing. And I love that kind of that thing about Mayans, or like the way, jade, its value wasn't just in some kind of like transactional thing of like, oh, this like gold equals this much, or jade for the sake of jade, but that it actually, the greenness of it was in some ways tied to, that vital color that is the energy of life. And that in carving the jade or wearing the jade, you're also in relation to that, in an animistic way, to that stone, to the earth, and to the colors in that stone. And jade looked wet when it was, polished, and so you're bringing water, like all of these complex way. Anyway, so that's a whole side thing. But and I lost my other train of thought.
Well, let's
As
see.
often
It might
happens.
come back. It might come back. But I really, because I've talked about this with my friend Kate Morales, who is also, mixed Nahua and does a lot of work scribing and sort of reclaiming kind of images as language. And I think about this in terms of like, you know, the mind does a very funny thing when it learns to write in an alphabet. The mind does a funny thing.
Yeah,
But for most of our ancestors, for the large freaking almost 300,000 years of our ancestry, um, it was like images and oral language.
yeah,
And that to me is a real, it's almost like a safety net or a home base that we seem to have forgotten in the digital age.
yeah.
Like, because the digital age is so interested in this kind of textual domination and
Hmm.
this kind of like exactitude,
Yeah,
but orality, which is language sort of divorced or like emancipated from its kind of textual prison, which it was very small, right? Like text based languages is very small compared to like oral language.
yeah,
And the fact that we lived in this 360-degree world in which image was everywhere and also like symbol was everywhere.
yeah.
The mountain is symbolizing, the bird is symbolizing, like, and then when our ancestors started carving or actually making art, it was about like symbol integration, right? It was like I take this jade from this place, which symbolizes this whole system of knowing, right? And then I mix it with this, you know, fiber or what,
Yeah.
like I take this and I take that and
Maybe
I,
tree fiber. Yeah,
right. And so you start to have this kind of really powerful symbolic scaffolding that starts to happen with image, where like fire and water and air and earth are like arranged in very particular yet dense ways, right? Like very dense
and still like
architecture.
materialistically tied to their origins. And so in
Yes.
some way it was still living. And that's one of my fears now is that so much of the type of communication we've created is so self-reflexive
Mm,
that it's just this kind of, it's like literally how often are we looking at screens and closing off all of these other senses and
right.
removing ourselves from that, those like embodied root places.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking a lot about, the loss of my grandmother. She passed in 2018, my mom's mom. And she just like her language is one of the things I try as much as I can just to keep her voice alive in my head and the way she spoke. I can never
Mm-hmm.
repeat it, but there was a sing-songness to when she spoke, and the way she told stories still had that oral history, um, like drama to it, and she spoke a type of Spanish very particular to her area of Guatemala, and um, there was so much beauty and wisdom and kind of layered, I don't know, spirit and everything she communicated. But one of the things I loved was a couple language things with her. One was, one time when we brought her to the States and she saw the washing machine going, all day. My mom had a lot of laundry because there's 6 kids
Yeah.
or six in the family. And my grandma said like, ay, pobrecita, like that poor machine. And she meant it seriously. She wasn't like making a joke. She was like,
No.
she worked so hard, and
Right.
it was like it was like it was a living it's like she's a living machine and she's working all day long. She never gets a break. And that
Uh-huh.
just struck me, like I really saw her pained with sorrow. And
Right.
yeah, and there were times where she would whip out words that none of us had heard of. We assumed they're Mayan, but I remember one time she was telling a story about the devil, and she used the word tihismates, el tihismates, and I was like, huh? I was like, what is? I've never heard this word. I've tried to Google it, look it up. I've never found it anywhere, and I don't know where it came from. And it was when she got dementia. Some of these other words that my mom hadn't heard since childhood started coming back into her language, like Mayan words and other kind of more folk ways of saying things.
Totally.
And I wish I could, I wish I still had access to that.
Totally.
There's so much
Right.
wisdom just
Right.
in the way she spoke.
I mean, I have a story I'd love to share with you about my grandfather because it speaks to something which I think is the heart of language and poetry and storytelling, which is not necessarily this written thing, but
Yeah.
it's like so my grandfather is Swiss and so comes from a time where like his father came over on Ellis Island, you know, that kind of thing, you know, like lived through the Great Depression and fight in the World War and all that crazy stuff, you know, like and like saw the first automobile, you know, like so go from horse to automobile, you know, like this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And at a time where like everyone just smoked cigarettes because that's what you did, right? It's like they're just like everyone's smoking. So my grandfather, his name was Roger Schmidt, but I called him Gang Gang. Uh, who knows why? Because that's what kids do. They just make up words and it sticks. That's how I said grandfather. And from when I was born, he only lived about 3 years. So he was bedridden by the time I was born, and he was dying of emphysema from the cigarettes, right? So, you know, just the way it is, right? And he would sort of make up stories that whole time with me. So I would be a baby laying in the bed because he's bedridden, and he would just make up stories, right? And I actually had complete and total LSD like experiences in that pre like pubescent, like, you know, 1 through 3 age, in which he would be telling stories about all the cartoon characters and comic book characters, like completely random, like Captain America meets Bugs Bunny and go on a trip to the moon or something, you know, like some just wild stuff, you know, because he was just like dreaming, talking, you know, like making up, and I'm just this little baby. But I would have these completely lucid consciousness like shifts where I was like 2 years old and I would have this glimpse of like, oh, you're going to remember this when you're like 35. And like completely like looking back through time and being like, oh, right, this is just what happens. And like having this complete and total like consciousness looks at itself through a web and goes, oh, yeah, it's all happening right now. You're not going to remember this for a while, kid, but it's okay. And being like, oh, what's happening? I'm just a little baby. I don't know what's happening. And then as I grew up and many other things happened, and of course taking lots of psychedelics and doing lots of things, having like complete and total memory regression flashbacks and being like, oh crap, that's happening right now. You know, like so he was doing something with language that was unlocking something in my brain or in my consciousness field. And I think this is the magic of oral tradition, which is not this, it's really quite plastic and strange, right? Where like he would just be going into a trance saying things about characters that don't exist, right? Like whatever. Batman and Spider-Man go on a trip or whatever, you know, go fight the bad guys or something. And that's like one level of the story, right?
He
But
was
the other
stirring the cauldron.
but the other level of the story is the bubbles in the cauldron being like, what's fucking happening when this is happening, right? Like the content of the story is actually not the main part of the story because the other part is, can you feel your brain like carving new knots in itself?
All
And
these
suddenly you're like traveling to the stars or something, you know?
Yeah, all these vast wild connections. I actually had an experience similar in that moment you talked about where you could kind of see into the like some future voice was saying like you won't remember this or something like that.
Yeah.
I remember being really young, like I don't know how old, but I had just heard these big, like I remember two concepts I had learned that week that I didn't fully understand. The word gay and the word cancer. And I knew that these things were adult. Like I knew that they were like kind of beyond, like one was like a sickness, but it was so mythic, you know, it's like a kid learning about cancer. It's like this big mythic like disease. And the other, I really had, for some reason, homophobia was never passed down to me. So I didn't have any judgment. I was just like more neutral, like, huh, gay, like, you know,
Yeah.
this thing that exists. And I remember kind of like holding these things, and then this almost like future voice was like, this, you may encounter, it was almost like, you may, like, these things are abstract now, but they won't be forever. It was that kind of a voice, and I can't even properly describe it to you, but it was
Yeah.
just like this future consciousness that said, yeah, you will encounter these again, and they will be real, and you will understand them in a different way. Like right now they're like, a rock you pick up at the beach and then drop somewhere on the walk. It's like
Yeah,
interesting
totally.
for a second. But and it was such, I remember it to this day, like, just I can remember the room I was in when I had that feeling, the basement room. So it was just like
Right.
a, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
so much mystery and how things work. And so, there's so much true magic in language, and so many things are opening. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think about this in terms of like what poetry can do in terms of like unlocking or re-unlocking this kind of oracular oral, almost like initiatory language, right? It's like when old people are telling young people stories, they're they are stirring the cauldron, which is an initiatory process. Like they're literally
Mhm.
like stimulating the system in a very particular way that's also like musical and random, and all sorts of things are happening, right?
Yeah.
But what I see poetry as really good at allowing us to do is this kind of remixing of language, which is to say, we may not have sort of obvious pictograms anymore, like, where if you put four pictograms in a row, that's 10,000 words. You know what I mean? Like, it's really a lot of, like, if we had to unpack that in linear text, four pictograms would be like pages and pages and pages, right?
Yeah.
But I think of poetry using English now, especially with the amount of queer, radical queer experimentation that's been happening in the last, like 10 years, like the ability to almost reimagine what that orality was like inventing hyphenated words and talking in ways that were like what your grandmother was saying, like these kind of really strange magic words that you can't really find, but they still have a presence. Like you're like, wait a second, that I feel something, even though I have no idea about the definition behind it. And there's a context that's mysterious. Um, and I find that when I choose to go into that door of poetry where I can actually go that far into like the left corner, like I can really go, oh, we're not here to explain. We're here to actually like reconstitute some way of speaking that we kind of are losing because of our digital age, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like pidgin English or something. It's really weird. Like you're kind of like making up folk language, with the hyphens and the kind of like weird little words that are kind of like accents on the
Yeah.
story, like this kind of thing that we can do with,
Because you use
and
a blank page too, and you're using things that kind of linear, packaged language doesn't have access to. You're using emptiness, you're using the line break, you're using the way space comes into it, and pause, and the visual, the punctuation is open,
punctuation is
more
open.
open doors
Yeah,
there. And yeah,
right.
it it's capturing truth in a way that we're constantly losing. It's like trying to hold on to this slipping thing and bring it and keeping it safe. And I think that's, and there's a reason poetry is, non-commercial for the most part. And I think if it were, it'd be in great danger. But there's it's this protected space where we really kind of see the malleability of language and just the mystery of it, and it's constantly changing and catching. I would wonder if maybe all poets, all people who practice this, are in some ways scavengers and sponges of things, and kind of moving in mysterious ways. I know not all are, because I've met some poets who are more narrative and linear, and they're happy to keep it that way. But yeah, yeah, I think there's a lot there's a lot of connection between oral traditions and poetry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it kind of like I like the poetry that like leaps off the page in a sense where like like a soundscape or like an ambient soundscape sort of can sort of um, almost be present in the text where and
Yeah.
of course we have a lot of hybrid poets now who are doing like music or soundscapes or like some other way of transmitting the poetry, you know, like whether it's ritual or um, turning poetry into song or like back and forth, you know, like this
Yeah.
kind of hybrid forms of communication, essentially, you know, like actually
Well,
exploding the form in a certain way. And I find that to be really, um, in some way, it's hopeful. It's inspiring that because it is pushing back against the kind of homogenization of language that we see because of the digital globalization, right? Um, it's pushing back. You know, I think about languages that I have no idea about, but that are based on like drums. You know, like in certain places in Africa, the drum came first, and their orality mimics drums. So when they're talking, it's like listening to like beatboxing. You know, it's like listening to like percussion. You know,
it,
it's like da da da. You know, this kind of real musicality to the like percussive nature of the language, you know, and that's communicating something else, you know.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. There's so much about what the thing that you said about homogenizing language. I think that's really scares me. And when I was younger, I remember we were kind of hermits in a way, like a little more isolated as a family. And me and my older sister, especially, she just had her own way of talking. And I remember there being a time when, like, even the word awesome or freaky, those words that I would hear other kids using, were somehow like taboo with my sister, because they imported meaning too easily. And that's like, I can say that now looking backwards, and then I didn't know why. It was just like it was too like the others, you know. And now I'm sadly I do use those words. Like it's like they've filtered in. But I really loved that moment where we had something that grew outside of this kind of like constantly mirrored, like eyes everywhere kind of culture, because it felt more like poetry, like language was growing spontaneously.
mm,
I find with, certain people like you, or, I have some other close friends who naturally speak more in a way that doesn't borrow so much from really, really quick at the ready. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that there's something else that can grow when language isn't so at the ready.
that's right. Where
Yeah.
you have to struggle a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something that I try to do with some of my clients who like come to me for animistic kind of work is like actually struggle with the description of the emotion that you're having in a certain part of your body, right? It's like because most people are like, it's just so simple. Anger. Where's, you know, it's like anger or fear or like it's already prepackaged. The emotional name is prepackaged. The like where it lives in the body is like, oh, it's in my heart. But it's like, yeah, but like what does that mean? Like what part of the heart? You know, like there's a real flattening of our experience because we like to name things very quickly. And it's that this is that like information thing you're talking about where it's like if I say I have a pain in my heart, everyone just checks it off the list. They're like, okay, I understand what that means.
Hmm.
Like, oh, I understand,
Oh,
whatever. And and everyone just, it's like, oh, okay. But for the poet, or for someone who really wants to not flatten it so quickly, you have to go deeper than that. You have to actually struggle to describe. You have to struggle, because most people, they ask me, they're like, how are you so good with speaking? Like, you seem to improvise so easily with language. I'm like, no, I'm just constantly struggling to describe what's happening. I'm just constantly struggling. But the more you constantly struggle, the more you just go, oh yeah, this is how it is. Like, you just have to go, uh, you know. But there is something to, like, I really want to give that to people. Like, it's okay to struggle, and it's okay to struggle in the middle of a conversation,
yeah,
to describe something that might not even make sense to the other person, but you took a step. Like, you took a big step in the direction of actually relating, right? You actually had to go, yeah, I don't know, there's like a silver tooth, I don't know, like, there's something happening in the struggling to describe, even though we may never truly describe it, in its fullest sense, right?
yeah. And I really, when I see that struggle in someone else, I recognize it immediately, and I respect it a lot because I associate that with truth. People who will struggle to arrive at something that's more truthful, even if the other thing is easier and it's just 1 degree less truthful. Like
Yeah,
there's,
totally, totally.
it's like you could say you're brokenhearted, but if you take that extra step to say, to give it the texture and the life behind that, I physically recognize that and I will respond to it because it makes it alive for me too. And that's something when I was teaching poetry, it's the hard thing to you never, no student ever wants to hear that this is a cliche. And so it's like, how do, that's the word, but how do we show why it is a cliche, or what is that flattening of meaning that's happening?
Right.
And I think you said it really beautifully. Actually, there was a poet friend of mine who is, how would I, one of these very truthful people whose language always surprises. I never know what they're gonna say next, and it I've never heard it before. It's like anything they say, it's always gonna come in some fresh way. And they're also I would say, like a nervous person, or an awkward person, but they come off as confident somehow. It's like they have this incredible kind of like nervous energy that's also so confident in itself. And we were talking once, and they said, I am incredibly awkward, and I I know my own awkwardness, but I've grown comfortable with that discomfort. And it was that, I think, it like what you were saying with your own struggle. It's like, if you can let yourself grow comfortable with the discomfort, then you can it can really look to others like a kind of confidence. And there's like not that it matters what it looks like to others, but I think it can grow and mature in really interesting ways. and
Right.
and so often we're worried that, if this awkwardness reveals itself, or the struggle reveals itself, it's going to look like I'm nothing, I'm a lie, or I'm this, or I'm that. When really, I think it's the opposite. When people can see that and really respect it and recognize themselves in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, there's something to, like there is one quality of skillfulness which is about sort of making things easier, right? Or something like that. Like, there is something to the, like, fluency, just like the fluency of things, and having a repertoire or something. But then there's something, to me, where if you go too far in that direction, you can really disguise your humanity. Like, you can really, like,
Yeah.
pretend to be not human, right? Like, you can pretend to be perfect or something. And but I think that the best art is a combination of the two, in which, like, someone is safe enough and has, like, enough of a repertoire in order to be, like, obvious with their struggle, like they're struggling in public, like they're actually, they're actually not willing to be bored in a certain sense, like socially or artistically or aesthetically. Like they're not willing to just keep checking off the little box of like, oh, I know what that means. It's a red wheel, or like, and art begs us to kind of do that. Like art begs us to go beyond the first impression, go beyond the first impression, the linguistic kind of labeling and categorization, and go deeper into the kind of like I do when you're writing a poetry or when you're writing a story and a tangent erupts and you get taken on a tangent.
Mm.
And for some people it's like, oh, that's a tangent, but it's like, no, that's the fucking life. That's the thing being alive,
Like
like
the ore,
yeah,
that you're mining for actually the whole time.
yeah, right. And I
Yeah.
and I love um this, and I don't even think I'm there completely yet. And this podcast has been a kind of ritual experiment in trying to see if I could explicitly not just talk about talking, but get to a place where enough people come on the show and enough people have listened to the show that if I do another kind of talk show or another kind of show, there's already the capacity for a surprise in the communication.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I'm completely honest with you. I don't think I'm there yet. I think I'm continually still defaulting to something that is normative, palatable, etc. You know, and I think that that's fine because it's like we do what we do to iterate forward. But it's just so interesting to me how much we have to find the others in order to strengthen this subversive, like, because really what I'm talking about is subverting communication in a way that,
Yeah.
like it might seem dangerous or it might seem weird or it might seem useless, like, oh no, the terrible useless thing.
But if this is you not fully there yet, it really just inspires me to know what that looks like. Because I believe, oftentimes I'll say like, oh, this isn't good enough for me, and people are like, oh, no, 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 but it's fine, and that might be true. But I know that there's an even greater form. I'm not ready yet to. I can't. I'm not equal to it. And so I'm just like mind blown. Like, I trust that that greater form in you is something I can't even comprehend and want to see because you've already created such an open, it really does feel like the thing that you're addressing, the thing that you're trying to look at gets to be embodied here. And we look through being in it. You've already done that,
Yeah,
and so I'm just like, wow, whatever your higher version of that looks like, I'm very interested in.
yeah,
And I also want to get there.
totally. I
Yeah.
mean, I do feel like on some level, the older I get, the more I'm trying to catch what my grandfather was maybe unconsciously trying to give me through the ancestors, which is something that is akin to like spontaneous improvisational storytelling, but also like it's initiatory and educational. Like it's not just random,
Yeah.
because the way that we hold each other, the way that we actually embody a kind of care, like a communal care, like it's not just here I am on the podium going to do my reading or whatever, you like poetry or something.
Yeah.
But there is something about the circular organismic quality of the responsibility of storytelling, the responsibility of language, but not just responsibility, but the kind of the channeling and the playfulness of like the spirit of language kind of erupting. And we see this wonderfully with like youth of color, right? They're inventing words, like they invent slang and catchphrases, like, it's just like
Yeah.
out there. And I'm really interested in that being a real, I don't think democratic is the right word, but like open source, I think is more correct word. Like the open sourceness of language is not just for academics. It's not just for people with like an MFA and, literary, whatever. But, because there's a way in which that happens.
This happen. I think about that a lot with, like with my parents who don't have degrees, and yet there's and in so many ways I could never, nothing I've ever learned in school could ever match some of the things they know. And because they haven't, maybe aren't an artist or a this or that, or it's like they, that social wrapper hasn't been presented to them to like hold that thing that they carry, and so it's devalued. It's
Right.
like, oh, you're a house painter, well, I'll take what you say with a grain of salt. It's
Yeah,
like, or
sure. Right. Yeah, it's totally weird. Yeah.
whereas like my dad is one of the greatest artists I know, and which is, it's like I believe that, and it's true, and the what I have to show for it is his doodles. It's like, how do I show this to the world, and even to himself,
Right.
or to my mom, who is a poet, but everything is private and for herself and in her journals,
Yeah.
and she has no attachment to this whole other literary world, which is foreign to her and alien and kind of cold and unalive.
Yeah,
And I'm,
totally.
and I'm like kind of ashamed that I'm even a part of it.
Yeah,
It's part of me.
totally. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's like, how can I bring, like, sometimes those things don't get to live in the same way as somebody who sits before you with a bio and an MFA and a book. It's like suddenly we all give that a special container. It's just like, so we just live in all these illusions, and
yeah.
any kind of thing that can help break those down, I'm interested in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something that like I think many of us are missing in our westernized siloed world is like community theater or community show and tell. It's like I imagine that many of our ancestors, they were all farmers, but they also did other things. It's like everybody
Yeah.
has a basic skill set and does a kind of role in the community. Like
Yeah.
your dad's a house painter and we need house painters, right? Like that's just great. It's not like better or worse than something else. It's
Like a
like,
highly skilled, yeah,
right.
very.
It's like, well, I mean, we need house painters, right? Like that's great. Like be whatever. Like, um, but there is something that I think we have, let go of, which is the interdisciplinary nature of just being a human being.
Yes.
That like a human being is both a hunter and a gatherer and a cook and a parent and a forager and a crafter and a carver and a basket, like maybe not all of those things, but like a good handful of those things, like really has an art and a kind of science and a kind of like role in the community that's maybe political, right? Like they're doing
Yeah.
all of these things. They're like full people, hopefully, like they're full people. Um, and I want to, in our rush to get somewhere in the digital age and in the kind of like whoever post-capitalist whatever the fuck we're doing but really is nothing, whatever, in this rush to get somewhere, we also rush to specialize,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
we rush to kind of carve out our niche, like I'm this or I'm that, but like there's really something to be said for like regular interdisciplinary people who have full lives, and because of the fullness of their lives maybe they can't go super deep in one area or something, you know what I mean?
You don't become the master of wood carving or whatever it is.
Yeah, something like that. Like maybe you don't do that. Like, but that isn't to say that like you don't have like a bevy of like really decent, aesthetically interesting pastimes. You know what I mean? Like,
I
yeah,
remember once when I was in, had been in college. I think, yeah, I was in college because I had just kind of found out about filmmaking, and that it's something you can actually learn and do. And I had gotten into this program on a scholarship at Columbia for the summer, and it was like a 1 month intro to filmmaking type of thing, and it was just all new for me, and I was exploring it. And I remember at one point I had a little one-on-one with one of the directors, and he said, well, tell me your interests. And I just listed all of these things. And he looked at me and was like, well, jack of all trades is a master of none. He was like, and I suggest if you like these other things, go into something else because filmmaking's not for you. He literally told me that. He was like, if you're a filmmaker, you're dedicated to it. That's the one thing on your mind. And I was such a little soft sponge then. It really did impact me. Like I really took that to heart. I was like, well, okay, I can't be a filmmaker. Like I can't. And
Sure.
I took a long, I went to poetry, which
Yeah.
was all welcoming at the time.
Yeah.
And it's only
Totally.
now they're like braiding back together. But it, yeah, there's such a stigma against the poor jack of all trades, but it
Yeah.
really is.
Oh, poor. Yeah.
Look at animals, how much they do, how much knowledge they have, in their even in their quote unquote, which isn't even true, but basic living. It's like even just in living there's so many skills involved in that from different arenas, and spirit has to live in all of it. Creativity lives in spirit, and so there's
Mhm.
everybody has to have a creative out, everything's creative.
Yeah. Everything.
Too.
Yeah.
It's like
Totally.
even house painting, there's every single thing has an expression of the body, and yeah.
And it's like in some Black Mirror episode kind of thing that we can think about. It's like, imagine if we go the distance with this kind of specialization, then like you have to hire a cook to make your food because you're not a cook, you're a poet. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
like if we can take that absurdity to its nth level, then everyone only specializes in one task, and has to like get,
A giant machine. Everybody's like one cog, and
yeah, totally. Oh man, this has been a rad conversation. So I want to thank you again for coming on and just stirring the cauldron with me because I don't get to talk to other folks like you enough. And
nice.
I love being able to do it. I'm curious if there are things you'd like to talk about in our final sort of maybe few minutes or whatever. We can go longer, but I'm cognizant of the time, and I'm just curious about sort of what keeps like what puts you on the edge of your seat these days in terms of your creative praxis, and maybe that is an easy segue into sort of like plugging projects you're doing, but it might not be. You might not like that question, so I'm totally open.
Well, with all the writing I've been doing the past few years, just kind of shifting into screenwriting, and it's opened up this whole kind of narrative thing for me that's it's very taxing, and I really love it, but it's also can be really torturous. And so I've really kind of um, let myself really embrace a creative practice that's not like that. And so I've been doing more ceramics lately, and drawing, and this tarot set just kind of appeared in October. I just started drawing every night. I wasn't planning to make a tarot set, or just was like, this draw. It was the first one I did was Temperance, which is a centipede with eyes on it. And I don't know why my mind just said temperance. It makes no sense because, and I went and kind of then came back with my organizing mind and gave found some reasons why temperance works for that card. And then it kind of grew from there, where I'd let myself create an unconscious image without any plan in mind. And then I would find which card it is. And so I've slowly created a major arcana, and I think that's been kind of driving me in a long, like when I when I'm kind of spent with the language stuff, I like to really shove my hands into the soil of something else, and I think that the tarot deck has been one thing, which I hope, but I don't know. I hope to kind of put into a form that others can partake in by the end of the year. That's my large plan for that, but it might take longer. Who knows? But what's been really exciting to me lately has just been reading more about mushrooms. I recently bought that book Entangled Life,
Mhm.
and just kind of immersing myself more in mycelium and the ideas of that. I think that's just central to everything. And I really want to kind of come back to nature. And so yeah, I've been really drawn to things that explore the world in that way and kind of re-examining um, Mayan culture too. Been kind of looking for new sources that where I can come back to it in a way that's maybe not so historical, or in other ways that I've been exposed to it in the past,
Mhm.
and through my own grandmother's tales. So yeah, I've just kind of been looking for ways to kind of put my hands in the earth, so to speak, in
Totally.
non-mental
Right, right,
ways.
right. Of course. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very important, to have these modes that we move from. Like, if you're really doing one mode of being or one mode of thinking in a certain way, or like one mode of creating, to really notice the architecture or the contours of that mode, and really also go, oh, that's not the only mode I should be inhabiting. Like there's a other space for my system to kind of do other things. And I'm really such a fan of like having three or four like ways of creating, so that we don't like get so that we can just continually just like, I don't know, run around the circle or something. Like there's a
Like your word
cyclical aspect.
mode is a great thing because it's kind of a whole body experience, and a different mode awakens different parts, or it's
Totally,
like we can bring, yeah, it's like we're the jellyfish, right? And we get to like inhabit these different shapes. And yeah,
totally.
yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I will just am saying this to the ether realm now. We're gonna put links and various things in the show notes, but if you want to say any links now, or where people can contact you or follow your work, that would be great.
Yes, I've been fairly good at keeping things updated on my Instagram, which is Tarot Obscuro, TAROT_OBSCURO. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
I like to I like to kind of like document artwork on there, and readings or things coming up. And then I have a website which I don't it's kind of a useless thing right now. I don't even know if I'll keep it because I don't really tend to it enough, and I'm not sure what it's yeah, there's a whole set of questions that come with it. But website is obscurobeach.com.
Yeah, yeah. And even if you shelf the website, you got to use that word, that term. You got to use the term again, because that's a great Obscuro Beach is like, I want to visit that place.
I I was actually thinking about that recently. I was like, maybe I changed the website from being like this kind of resume type document that was always created to like get into a program or get a scholarship. It's kind of like this like fossil of things I needed in the past, and now I was thinking about Obscuro Beach because there's a whole story. There's a
Yeah.
whole story of how that came to be, and I'd love to kind of, what would it be to make the visiting of the website the visiting of Obscuro Beach.
Yeah, totally. I'm totally into that kind of like multimedia for the sake of like, oh, here's a portal into another world. Like it's not actually selling you anything. Like,
But I love that, and my partner, who studied web design in college, made what for one of their final projects made, I can't remember what it was called, but it was like a project for school, just like make a website. And what they did was, it's like you get to the site and there are basically doors that you can click on. One of the doors is like a bowl in a tree. One is an actual door. One is like a floating window in the sky. And this music starts playing when you open the website. And it's kind of eerie. And you click on the door and it's like suddenly you go into this dark. It was almost like a video game
yeah,
more. And I was like, I was like, I would like that to be my website. Just take
yeah,
someone somewhere and give them like a full body
yeah, yeah,
experience.
totally. Right. Like you're finding an artifact, right? It's like you're, And the artifact is multidimensional, and you can like walk around in it a little bit like that, you know, this kind of portals to other places.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that was really the, when you remember the beginning of the internet, that was part of the like amazing rush of energy that everyone felt, is like, oh, you can just like make little worlds and hyperlinks, and whoa, you know, there was a real, before it got colonized by all the big companies, you know, the internet was kind of like very punk rock, you know, artistry, you know, it was like punk art, you know.
Yeah, it was all it was all so rough around the edges too, which I really like now.
Yeah,
And
totally.
one of the first we I remember when we finally got a computer in our house, and then there was this whole concept of like computer games, and my siblings and I all found Mist. I think at
Oh,
Block.
yeah,
I
miss.
think that you could rent them from Blockbuster or something, but
Yeah.
we got Mist, and it was like a whole family affair. Like we would be like, click there, click. You know, it was just this incredible. And it's all Mist is like my favorite game because I don't even know what happens. Like you're just like finding things and opening them. You find a
Yeah.
journal, you read it, you open a door, like
Yeah,
you're
totally.
looking for keys or like you're looking for things that just open other things.
Yeah, totally.
And
Yeah.
it's all mysterious and it all means something bigger, but you never find out what.
Yeah, and you don't really care.
You don't
You
care. You're
don't
there for
really
the
care what's happening, you know? Totally.
It's the best game.
Yeah. I remember those days too. That was, yeah, I mean, that was like the promise of virtual reality was really the promise of being able to dream together while we were awake, right? Which is essentially what all of our entheogenic ancestral rituals were too. But like the, you know, like this, we're all searching for the same thing over and over again. You know, it's not really any different. But this ability to dream together and actually have an experience, um, that actually changes us, even though it's not real. I mean, like whatever, it is real, but like we have this kind of, we like to believe there's a barrier, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
And so we just all go watch movies and go, it's not real. Yeah, okay.
yeah, yeah. And I think that was one of the things that blew my mind when I was 18 or something and found a book on Jung. Or I don't remember how I was exposed to Jung, but um, that idea of the psyche being real and that what you dream is taken seriously as an experience that you have had. I just
Totally,
that opened up
100%.
so much for me. But anyway,
Yeah,
I feel like we could literally talk for 18 more hours and
we
still
probably could. Well,
not be done.
we will put a pin in it because I have ideas about how to sort of open up the conversation in the future, and now you're part of that conversation, so I'm really happy, and I'd love to end with a like we began with bibliomancy. Let's end with bibliomancy. So what's a question or an intention that you think will guide us?
How can I open myself more truthfully to the greater forces within and without?
Okay, so let's feel into that again. How can I open myself more truthfully to the greater forces
Within and
within and
without.
without? Okay, you're gonna do it again. You're gonna tell me to stop on the page, and then I'll move my finger around, and then you'll tell me to stop again. Okay, so
Okay,
wisdom. Here we go.
stop,
Ooh. Hmm.
stop.
Okay. Their, like their, like their. So their secondary role as instruments of love makes them susceptible to a spiritual metamorphosis which identifies them with the Urus of the Muslim paradise.
Their
It,
secondary
role.
and the role of love. I love that so much for this answer. You know, because it's like what is love but an attraction and a curiosity and an opening in ourselves that's full of light, and possibility and creativity and creation. And then also this kind of humbling, like
Yeah.
yeah, you are, this open, remembering kind of that first of all, you aren't primary. So I
Right.
think there's something, and that's kind of what I kind of drew from that. What about you? What did you see?
I mean, I think it's really like, in my mind, it was like a trick where it was like, oh, you think their secondary role is an instrument of love, but it's their primary role. It's like there's something about like the hidden nature of love as the foundation of all creation. Like that,
Mhm.
like whatever you want to think about the cold, hard reality, it's not that. It's like there is this, like we are all existing because of some innate, like what you said, some innate attraction, some innate like uh, amour, like some real amorous, erotic interest.
You see that in
It's
molecules, like whatever that force is that draws things together, it's there. I think there's a Clarice Lispector moment where she says something like the world began when one molecule said yes to another, something like that. But it's just this,
right,
it is love, and we see it in plants, we see it, and it is this kind of
right,
beautiful force of connection.
yeah. And I think, going back to your original question is like remembering that we are instruments of love is really, I mean, it sounds sappy on some level, but it's also just very simple and grounding. Like like we can get really spun out in our like reasons for doing
Yeah.
things.
And I like the word instrument because I think of breath, or like a flute, or even a guitar string that we are played upon. We things come through us. We are touched by greater forces, and the best way to be open to everything is by like letting that sense of love be the thing that widens and expands us and plays through us and all of it.
Totally. Awesome.
I love it.
It's just never ending fun when we collaborate with the universe, you know.
Mhm.
Um,
The universe wants to play.
the universe wants to play. Stephanie, thank you so much. Blessings to you and all your relations for everything that you have been doing, and also just for coming on and jamming with me for 2 hours. I'm so amazed sometimes when people say yes to this, thing. Like, okay.
I'm so glad I
Um,
did, Dare. It really felt sacred to me. Thank you.
right. Well, blessings to everyone listening. As we said, the links will go in the show notes and to be continued.
To be continued. Yeah, I hope so.
Awesome. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you, everyone. Blessings. This has been Underworld Party.